Right, good afternoon everybody. I'm here today to provide a general update on the Northlands January case that we've been dealing with this week, and some general remarks around New Zealand's approval and supply process around vaccines. Before I hand over to the Director General for some of the finer information around our Northland case, I'm very pleased to confirm that all of the close contacts of the case have now been tested, their results have returned, and all have been negative. Of course, there's still a lot of work going on around the investigation, and this is an encouraging development in that process. It provides a bit of further reassurance around the way the response to the case has been managed, and I'm very encouraged by it. There's also some additional good news on the Covid-19 response front. I've received figures across my desk this morning in terms of the total number of tests that we have processed. So 10,812 tests were processed yesterday, which takes us to a total of 1,504,309 tests since the Covid-19 pandemic began. Each one of those tests, including the tests from Northland yesterday, is helping to keep our community safe. We're hugely appreciative of everybody who has taken a test or who has had a test or who has administered the test. It's a huge undertaking. Our testing rate of over 1.5 million tests means that we have, equal with Australia, the highest rate of testing per positive case of anywhere in the world. And I think that shows that New Zealanders are all playing their part, getting the tests when they need to get a test so that we can ensure that we keep Covid-19 out of our community. So a particular thanks once again to those who are working on the front lines administering those tests. It is an integral part of our response. I'll now hand over to the Director General, and then I'll have a few more comments on vaccines before we get into questions.
Thank you, Minister. Kia ora koutou katoa. I'll start today with the routine case numbers update. There are 4 new border-related cases of Covid-19 since 9 a.m. yesterday morning, all in managed isolation and quarantine facilities. There is 1 further historical case. Another previously reported case has now been reclassified as under investigation, and our total number of active cases is 68. I will update you, as the Minister mentioned, on the Northland case now, including testing results and contact tracing. Before I do, I just want to reiterate our thanks to everyone in the community and those in the health workforce locally and throughout the country for hard work, patience and cooperation as we've moved to respond to this case. The initial response to a case like this does present logistical challenges, but it's the swift action of those involved, including those who follow the public health messages, that ensures the response is successful in heading off any community transmission. There are encouraging signs in Northland so far, but a reminder the situation is evolving and we're not breathing out just yet. So, as the Minister mentioned, all of the close contacts of the Northland case have returned negative results. The Public Health Unit has reconsidered the classification of the close contacts, and actually only 11 are genuine, or what we might call true close contacts. Those are the ones who will remain in isolation for the full 14-day period since they last had contact with the case and will be retested. The important thing is that the test results on the entire 16 who were initially considered close contacts have been confirmed as negative. In terms of other contact tracing, there are 353 guests who departed the Pullman Hotel between the 9th and 24th of January, remembering that the 9th of January was the date that the, what we might call index case here, inside the facility arrived there. We previously reported that number as 357, but 3 of those people have actually returned overseas, and another 1 was a duplicate. Of these 353 guests, all have been contacted, and 255 have returned a negative test so far, and our contact tracing centre is following up with the other 98 departed guests to ensure that they either have been or are being tested. 14 of those contacted reported some symptoms when they were contacted, and 13 of those people have already returned a negative test result, and 1 is pending. Yesterday we reported 157 staff from the Pullman Hotel were being tested, and that figure's now been increased and updated to 212, and we will be able to give an update on the number of tests pending from that group later on. But all the results that we have so far on the staff from the Pullman have come back negative. Now, just as part of the follow-up of those who have departed, those 353 guests, our past experience shows that we may find one or two positive test results. And in fact, yesterday we had initial test results that came back positive on 2 people. And further investigation, which we do immediately with further testing and serology, was able to demonstrate that one of those cases was historical, or one of those test results was an historical case, and one was not a case. Now, we've seen this in our facilities where sometimes we'll see people have negative day 01 tests, negative day 3 tests, even negative day 7 tests if they're considered a possible close contact of someone from a flight, but then return a positive test later in their visit. So this is a situation where someone has previously been infected and the test, which can be very sensitive, may just pick up a fragment of the virus and return an initial positive result. We may get other positive results like this, and each one we will investigate. If we think further action is required, of course, we will undertake that further action immediately. As the Minister mentioned, over 10,000 tests processed yesterday, and over 8,000 of those were in the Auckland and Northland regions, testament to staff doing testing out in the community, in our general practices and at other locations, and I want to thank them as well as our lab staff. I understand that by yesterday afternoon the testing stations were clearing for the most part any backlog, and Healthline is also reporting just short wait times of around 5 minutes. To date, 327 people have been confirmed as having been at one of the 31 locations of interest, and either through push notification or media publicity, and so far we have negative test results on 127 of those people. Remember, people are a priority and should be isolating and getting tested if they were at a venue that the case was at in Northland at the same time and on the same date, or of course anyone who has symptoms, whether in Northland or anywhere else around the country. And finally, as the Minister may have mentioned, we've had some increased use of the COVID Tracer app, which is pleasing. Over 1 million scans done in the 24 hours to midday yesterday. Several 100,000 people have now turned on Bluetooth, and I just want to demonstrate how you might do that. An important point is this is a specific requirement inside the app. It's not just having Bluetooth turned on your phone. And if you're in the app, it will look like that. The dashboard will look like that. And if you have Bluetooth turned on, the second line down will have a green there. It shows I have Bluetooth turned on. It's very easy to turn on. You don't really want to be turning it off if you've got it on, but you just go into it and then turn it on and it will show green. Please do that and keep scanning. The Bluetooth functionality complements the QR code scanning. Both, as we have seen in this case in Northland, are incredibly helpful for us being able to respond if we do get a case. Covid-19 is a tricky virus. It's up to everyone to take these simple actions. We've shown we can in the past. The virus is the problem and people are the solution. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Dr. Bloomfield. Just wanted to make a few additional remarks on vaccines. There is a huge amount of interest in vaccines both in New Zealand and around the world, understandably so. We want New Zealanders to be reassured that our processes are robust and that we are moving as quickly as we can. We are getting the balance right here between moving rapidly whilst also ensuring that the process is very, very thorough and New Zealanders can have confidence when we do roll out the vaccine that it has been through the necessary approvals process. As the Prime Minister outlined yesterday, next Tuesday, MedSafe will seek advice and recommendations from the Medicines Assessment Advisory Committee around the Pfizer vaccine, which is the first vaccine we're expecting to arrive in New Zealand. The Ministerial Expert Advisory Committee will then review MedSafe's assessment, and depending on their feedback, MedSafe could be in the position to grant provisional approval as soon as the following day, which would be Wednesday, the 3rd of February, well in advance of any expected delivery of the Pfizer vaccine. So I want to reiterate very, very clearly that the thorough process that MedSafe has been through has in no way delayed the arrival of any vaccines here in New Zealand. The approval is still, unless of course they decline it, but the approval, if the approval happens next week, is still well in advance of when we would be expecting to receive any shipments of the Pfizer vaccine. So we recognise that there is significant public interest in dates. The date on which we start vaccinations is, of course, important. A more important date, though, is when we finish our vaccination process. So I do want to reiterate this is likely to be a year-long process. It's important to note when we start vaccinating, vaccines will not be available to the public at large. Our first shipments of vaccines will be very carefully targeted to those most at risk, which in the first instance will include our border workers, those working in our managed isolation facilities, and their closest contacts. And then as we progress, we will expand the net out wider. We do want to scale up to making vaccines available to the general public as quickly as we can, but that will depend on the supply being available. So what I want to reiterate today is that we do hope to take our first delivery of Pfizer vaccines as soon as we can. The MedSafe process being complete is an integral part of that. And then, of course, we then have to wait until Pfizer is able to send those. Now, happy to take your questions, Jess.
Minister, AstraZeneca have been given a bit of a serve by the EU, saying that the vaccines that they deliver should be kept in Europe as the first priority. What does that mean for us? We have some audit.
Look, we've got a diversified portfolio, as we've mentioned before. We've purchased 4 different vaccines. You can never anticipate when you begin a process like this, what's going to be first, what the delivery sequence is going to be, what the efficacy rates of the different vaccine candidates are going to be. And so, if you like, New Zealand has tried to spread our risk by buying into 4 different vaccine candidates. AstraZeneca, we have some pre-purchase agreements with them. I know that they will be working hard to deliver those. But again, I just want to highlight this is an international crisis that we're dealing with. There will be very heavy demand for vaccines right the way around the world. And New Zealand is, we're working very hard to make sure we get the supplies that we need of vaccines here in New Zealand.
When you start mass vaccinations, how many months do you predict it will take to vaccinate 5 million people?
Well, I mean, if you just look at the maths on that, it's actually, you have to vaccinate about 10 million times to get to 5 million people, because you'll need a double dose of that. Depending on how many we can get up to a day, if we were getting up to, say, 50,000 a day, you do the maths, that's about 200 days it would take to complete the overall vaccination campaign. It may well be that we can have a series of targeted events, if you like, where we can get those numbers up significantly higher than that. But we just have to, it will be a numbers game, and at this point we're planning for scaling up as quickly as we can. We're looking at the workforce and so on. Just want to reiterate though, when the first lot shipments arrive, that's not the space we're going to be in. We're going to be in the space of very much focusing those on the workforce.
So could we have that mass vaccination done by if we start in June, like you said, that's our plan, it could be done by the end of 2021? Would that be a best case scenario?
That would certainly be something that we would aspire to do. Again, that's going to depend a lot on shipments and on, the other 3 vaccines have to go through the appropriate approvals process and so on. So there's a lot of water to flow under the bridge. But our goal overall is to get a vaccination campaign underway as quickly as we can and to get it completed as quickly as we can. But there's still a lot of what-ifs in that equation.
Going to Pfizer, are you concerned that the production issues with Oxford AstraZeneca will put our vaccination program back as other companies kind of scramble to get their hands on it?
No, not necessarily. Like I said, we've purchased 4 different vaccines, and we're expecting several of them to be coming to New Zealand in greater numbers towards the middle of the year. So we will have some options here.
Also, some suggestion that that there could be pressure on Pfizer not to ship out of Belgium as well. Are you concerned about that, the ramifications there?
Look. Like I said, I'm not blind to what's happening around the rest of the world. We have done what we can do in terms of getting the pre-purchase agreements that we have and securing the supplies, to support that. So we're doing everything we can at the New Zealand end. But again, like I said, we can't necessarily control what's happening around the rest of the world. But I know that the pharmaceutical companies who are developing the vaccines will be working very hard to fulfil the obligations that they've signed into. I'm happy if the Director General wants to add to that.
Just one supplementary comment here. These vaccines are not being manufactured just in one location. And in fact, in the case of the AstraZeneca vaccine, Australia has a licensing arrangement to start manufacturing that onshore in due course. So it's not just dependent on the manufacturing of it in Belgium or in one specific country.
Can I just ask, what is the point in going through the MedSafe approval process when you've got far more sophisticated and better resourced regulators like the FDA and European regulators? Why not just rely on the decisions that they make?
So 2 comments here. First of all, just to be clear, the vaccine has been used in other countries, most other countries, on the basis of an emergency approval, not an actual registration process or having gone through a full registration process. The second point is MedSafe assesses the benefits and risks for the use of any medicine or vaccine here in New Zealand, depending on the situation here. And of course, we would want them to look at the benefit-risk equation for New Zealanders. That doesn't mean to say they are not using the data in particular, that the TGA, they've been working closely with the Australian TGA, but also they're using the information and data that those other regulators have used as well to help inform their decision-making process here, to help ensure that it is safe and effective for use in our circumstances in New Zealand.
Is there anything unique about New Zealand circumstances that make us different to anybody else in the world getting it?
Well, what is unique at the moment, of course, maybe not unique, but New Zealand is amongst a small number of countries where we don't have wide community transmission and an extent significant outbreak and emergency. And that's where the countries that have done most of the vaccination to date are in that situation. We're not.
Okay, well,
Minister, going back to Jess's very first question, do you agree with the principle that countries which are seeing COVID-19 right throughout the community should be ahead of the queue than New Zealand?
look, that is the reality. That is what is happening now. And it's very difficult on humanitarian grounds to argue against that. I think one of the things the World Health Organization have warned against is the whole notion of vaccine nationalism. And I think it's a very pertinent warning to everyone around the world. We all need to be thinking about that.
Just further to that, would New Zealand consider, or has New Zealand considered using diplomatic and trade channels against the European Union through the WTO or something to ensure that it upholds its existing commitments to free trade in terms of exporting things that other countries and companies have paid for?
Look, that's all very premature at this point. I think we've got a little bit of water to flow under the bridge before we would have those kind of conversations.
Pfizer vaccine gets approved by MedSafe. For people who have received both doses overseas of the Pfizer vaccine, would any rules change for them coming into the country, whether, if they're New Zealanders coming in, or even would there be rule changes for people who are not New Zealanders but have been vaccinated?
To be honest, I can't see that happening quickly. I've always said that, in terms of our border restrictions, vaccination will play a role here at some point. I don't think that's likely to be sudden or quick. I think it's likely to happen over a period of time. But it's still too early to get into what that might look like.
Australia's today started rolling out an advertising campaign for their vaccine. When can we expect to have that sort of campaign ramping up here in New Zealand to educate people before the vaccine lands?
So we are working on that. Preparation is underway for a public campaign, a public awareness campaign, a public reassurance campaign around the fact that the vaccine's safe. And again, I want to reiterate our approvals process is an important part of that. We do see from New Zealanders what the Director General and I would both have described as vaccine hesitancy. So it's not that people are necessarily opposed to vaccination, so they want to know when they're getting it that it's going to be safe. So our approvals process here and providing reassurance that it's a very thorough process is actually a really important part of our public campaign towards preparing to start rolling out the vaccines around the country. But we will have a paid advertising campaign, you've seen that we can do that very effectively. We've had some very effective advertising campaigns over the summer. We had very effective advertising campaigns during our lockdown. We'll be making sure that we've got a good public advertising campaign when we need to do that, and in advance of the rollout.
Do you have a budget for that at this point?
I don't have a number off the top of my head, but I can certainly get you an indication of the sort of money that we'd be intending to spend on that.
Would you want to be rolling that out in the next sort of couple of weeks, months, or February, March?
It's likely, I'll ask the Director General, I know he's been involved in helping to put the campaign together. We will be aiming to roll out the campaign before we start making vaccines available to the public.
So there are two parts to it. One is making sure that all the information is available, credible information is available to people, and then there is, as the Minister said, the public advertising communication campaign about the vaccine, when people can expect it, and so on. And you'll start to see that in the next few weeks.
So you just mentioned targeted events once the vaccine is being rolled out to public. Does that look like pop-up centres, like for example with testing, but just to get the jab?
That's right. So I think we'll be looking at, it is ultimately going to be a numbers game once we get to the point where we have enough vaccines to start making them publicly available. At that point, it really does become how quickly can we make them available? What's the best use of resource as well? So is it better to spread smaller numbers more thinly, or actually focus on some significant throughput? So those are all the sorts of equations that are being worked through. Finalising those kind of plans can't really be done until we've actually got a more accurate delivery schedule, so we know exactly what's arriving, when it's arriving, because that will help to inform things such as who gets which vaccine. So all of that stuff is, there's a whole lot of different options that have been worked through in planning, but we won't be able to lock that down until we've got a little bit further ahead. We'll come to Luke.
Can you remind us of the proportion of the population you think will have to be vaccinated in order for this to be effective? And have you commissioned or received any sort of polling or survey data on what proportion of the population are prepared to go and get a vaccine?
So I can respond to both those questions. I think we'd want to see at least 70% of the population vaccinated, and of course in part that depends too on the efficacy of the individual vaccine. The results we've had from vaccines like Pfizer with 90 to 95% efficacy, it's very high, really good. Others may be a bit lower than that, but they're still very high. But obviously the higher the better. And in terms of your second question, yes, we have been doing some population surveying, and what we know at the moment, and this was some results just in December, around 70% of people say that if they had good information, they wouldn't hesitate to get the vaccine. There's another 20% of people who would want to be really assured, and I would call that group the vaccine hesitant. They need good information, they need advice from people they trust. And then somewhere up to 10% of people at this point are saying that they wouldn't be vaccinated.
How was that 70% figure landed on? Can you just talk us through that? Because compared to, vaccines we're more familiar with, like measles and that sort of thing, it's up in the 90s.
I would call that a minimum level, and I'm using that because I've seen others, scientific colleagues, use that figure. It depends on the efficacy of the vaccine. The key point here is that the more people who are vaccinated, the more people who have individual protection, and the more likely we are to be able to get that herd immunity effect where we stop any transmission within the community if the virus is there.
So Dr. Bloomfield,
We'll come up the back here.
Just on the Northland case, have any of her close contacts required a second test because they've developed symptoms since the first time they were tested?
Not at this point, but all close contacts do receive a second test before they finish that isolation period.
Can you clarify who exactly is required to self-isolate for 14 days in terms of her close contacts and who isn't?
So it will be the revised number, which is the 11. So those are people who had, more prolonged direct contact with her. Some quite extensive, her partner, and others who may have, I think, were in a retail setting who spent a period of time, perhaps over 15 minutes, in reasonably close contact with her. Those are the ones who would do the full 14 days from their last exposure.
Audrey.
Yeah, for a colleague, can you please comment on how you think Northland reacted generally to this case, and what you would do differently next time because of it?
Look, I mean, I'll make some introductory remarks and say I think Northland responded incredibly positively. I think there was a bit of anxiety, certainly in the early phase, as there always is in a situation like this. But I think Northlanders generally proactively went out and sought testing if they were showing symptoms, did all of the right things. I think the case concerned did all of the right things in terms of keeping very good records that allowed us to get ahead of any potential outbreak. So I think this is the system operating as we would hope that it would operate.
Would you do anything differently next time?
I think every one of these that I have been involved in the response to has been different from the last. So you always look back on it. We haven't really had the chance to do that with this one yet and say, are there areas where we could change the way we do things? But what I've discovered is that the next time you deal with something, it's never the same as one of the ones that you've dealt with before. But again, I'll ask the Director General to comment on both of those things.
Yes, one of the particular things we're really focused on is the waits that people have at testing stations. We know there's going to be that pressure. And even though we stand up a lot of extra testing capacity, I've talked with my colleagues across government yesterday, and a team is going to work on what else we can do because I don't think it is acceptable if people have to wait for hours, especially if it's hot and in a car and they need access to food and water and obviously bathroom facilities. So we're looking at ways we can immediately surge in support from others. For example, it might be civil defence team or police to help with the management of those queues and perhaps have people walking through them, protected, and finding out whether that people there actually do need to be tested. If so, do some allocate times out where they can go away and come back, make sure there are bathroom facilities available and food and water. So I think that's something we could do better. There's always this immediate interest, and a lot of it's because people are worried, and so we should be able to do better on that.
Just on that point, do you accept any responsibility for this? I mean, we've been through setting up testing stations a number of times now. Why are you still not getting it right?
Well, I think what we are getting right is getting the testing stations widely available and getting people through there and getting tested. And we've seen this happen a few times. I should note that we also saw it happen. It happened in Australia. I saw the reports there from last month as well. So we're thinking yesterday, what are some things we can and should be doing to actually improve the experience for people next time?
So there's still a continuation of conflicting advice with Healthline saying get a test and then people turning up to testing stations being told they don't need one. Why is that still happening?
Well, look, we work really hard on getting a common script for Healthline and for those who are testing, and of course for our general practices, to make sure there is alignment. Occasionally there are mixed messages, and we just keep reiterating that out. But the important thing is that if people are concerned or they get mixed messages, that they do call Healthline and get a clear steer.
Okay, we'll come back over here.
Have you been advised when you'll be receiving that specific delivery schedule from Pfizer, and how much notice will you actually need to organise scheduling for staff, resources to actually administer it once it arrives?
I think the key thing for us is making sure we're ready to go whenever it does arrive. So that planning is well advanced. The Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, who are managing our facilities, our isolation and quarantine facilities, are working very hard to make sure that they've got a good system in place, not just for the staff members, but for their families as well. And so that involves getting some lists together of who we want to be vaccinating in that early wave of vaccines. So that preparation's well underway. In terms of the overall schedule, Pfizer, I don't want to put my penny down on a particular schedule until Pfizer can come back and say, look, we're locked in. And at that point, they haven't done that. So everything else up until that point is a discussion. But I'm not going to set out what those discussions are, because until they actually say, this is what we're going to do and this is what we're signing up to, I don't want to, get ahead of that. Amelia.
Can you just provide an update on the Northland woman, sort of how she's faring, whether she's isolating at home and how that's being monitored?
Yes, actually, she's now considered recovered because she has met the definition of 10 days since symptom onset and at least 72 hours symptom-free. She's still at home with her partner, who is isolating for the period, so still around home. So I'm very pleased that she is not just considered recovered, but that she has recovered from the illness and she's well again.
Are you making any changes to protocols in managed isolation in light of this recent case, and how will you be communicating that and how will it roll out?
So certainly we always look after these kind of cases at, are there things that we can learn from this? Are there things that we can do better? As I've mentioned before, we've been doing regular rolling infection prevention and control audits in our managed isolation facilities. Every one of those has come up with some further improvements that we can make. That process will continue. We're in a continual improvement cycle here. I don't think we will. I've yet to get to the point where I'm happy to say, look, we've done everything we can. There's always going to be new things that we can do, and we'll keep looking for those new things. So yes, there are likely to be further changes as a result of what we find from this. We're working through that process now. There's a question about getting the balance right here between completing the current investigation process and making sure we're doing all of the response part of that as quickly as we can, whilst at the same time saying, are there further changes we can make in response, to prevent these kind of things in the future?
There's also an Otago's pub that's been offering a 10% discount if you scan in. Do you think that places should be incentivising people to do it, and would you encourage this kind of behaviour to help people get in the mode and have that scanning culture?
I'd certainly encourage it. What I don't want to do is end up in a position where people are just scanning every QR code they walk past willy-nilly, even if they're not going to that place, just because they want to get their numbers up and increase their chances of winning something, for example. So, look, no human beings are perfect, but we can certainly encourage people to be scanning, and if businesses are out there encouraging people to scan, that's a good thing. I've mentioned before making sure that QR codes are very prominent everywhere, readily available, that they're in good condition, something that every business can do. I've been to places where they've had them on the tables, so that if you don't scan on the way in, you can scan as soon as you sit down. All of those sorts of things actually make a difference, and so I'd encourage everybody to be doing that.
A Nelson Cafe is banning people who have recently left managed isolation after the latest community case. What's your reaction to that?
Look, I don't think that people should be making up their own set of rules here. This is the same response I've given to all of these sorts of things, where people take their own initiative and do things that are potentially infringing on other people's rights and freedoms. We are working very hard to keep our team of 5 million all rowing in the same direction. And so while I do understand the anxiety and the concern, we wouldn't be releasing people from managed isolation if we thought that there was a risk that they were bringing COVID-19 into the community. That's what the process is designed to stop. And across the 100,000 plus people now who have left managed isolation, we have dealt with a handful of incidents where we've been able to contain those very, very quickly.
Some in Northland feel the government needs to have stricter rules for the release of returnees from managed isolation, perhaps an extra test. Are you considering that?
So as I foreshadowed, it was either yesterday or the day before, we are looking at the end of stay protocols and whether any further changes should be made there. I'll come over here.
We ask Minister, has there been changes to the funding for testing stations north of Whangarei?
No, there hasn't been any. I haven't seen any evidence that funding is an issue. So I think capacity is always an issue, but funding is not the capacity constraint, if you like. We fund what we need to fund in order to get the testing done.
So what sort of talks have you had with Australia about resuming travel? Are you expecting travel to resume tomorrow night with that one-way bubble?
No, I haven't had any conversations in the last sort of 18 or so hours since I last stood here. The Prime Minister is in regular contact with Scott Morrison. I'm not sure whether they have had a conversation since our update yesterday, but obviously that's a decision for Australia, bearing in mind that the travel between New Zealand and Australia was a unilateral decision by the Australians, so they made the decision to remove isolation for New Zealanders arriving in Australia. It wasn't part of our Trans-Tasman bubble. We haven't got to that point yet, but we continue to have those conversations with them.
And a question for a colleague. Iwi leaders in Northland are telling people over 50 to stay at home to prevent getting infected. Are they overreacting?
Like I said, I think people should follow the public health guidance. I think it's really important that people don't start issuing their own guidance. That's the sort of thing that leads to people being confused and potentially ending up doing the wrong thing.
Just a question for Dr. Bloomfield. If we reach this 70% figure that you talked about for vaccinations, does that mean that you would feel confident then, giving advice to the government, that they could reopen the borders?
We'd have to see, because it depends, of course, which 70% have been vaccinated. And I dare say, whilst 70% is a figure, it would be a minimum. Our aspiration is way higher than that. We would be aspiring to get up around 90%, and we would be making sure that every New Zealander had the opportunity to receive the vaccine.
Okay, I'll take a couple more questions. So what I might do, because we're running short of time, is I'll start over here and we will work our way across the room again. So, Jenna.
How concerned are you with the potential issue of people coming back to New Zealand for 3 months and a few days so that they don't have to pay for MIQ, but they're essentially here for a holiday, and how often does that happen?
Look, you can never, wherever we set the line, there's a potential that somebody might try and find their way around that. We discussed that as a cabinet, actually, when we were setting the time frame. 3 months is still a pretty long time to be here before you're allowed out, if you like, of the obligation to having to pay. There will be some people who can afford to do that, who can afford to come back for 3 months, but we're talking, I suspect, a very, very small number of people. And wherever we drew the line, we were always going to have that dilemma.
This is working on a booster shot in the case that its vaccine doesn't work against the variants. Is it something we're looking at purchasing or in discussions with Pfizer?
Look, with the we went through this yesterday. With the flu jab, there are different versions of the flu jab. Our approvals processes allow for that. With any vaccination campaign, you get new vaccinations. But I'll hand over to the Director General to talk particularly about the booster.
Yeah, thanks for that. And our science and technical team just did a nice update on this work in the last few days. I mean, all the vaccine manufacturers are now doing studies in the lab to see if their vaccine produces a similar response to these new emerging variants, like the one first identified in the UK or the one first identified in South Africa, to confirm that they do still have, at least in the lab, generate the same response, or if it's a lower response, how much lower. And it's very early days yet. But as you say, Pfizer and I imagine other vaccine manufacturers will start to look at whether they need to make any alterations to their current vaccine to help address emerging variants. What this does show also is that, similar to the influenza virus, we would expect this virus to keep changing, and that suggests that over time it will be one that we will need to do repeat vaccinations on, and the vaccine will need to be updated.
Okay, we'll keep working our way across the room. Yes.
Is there any update on how exactly the Northland case picked up this, was infected with COVID-19 in North?
No further firm leads as yet, but we continue to look at all the different opportunities. In particular, I know there's a lot of interest in the potential that it was air transmission, show the aerosol transmission, and whether or not, it's unlikely if we look at the evidence around the globe, but whether or not the ventilation system might have played a role there. We had an initial assessment done yesterday of the Pullman ventilation system, and I'm expecting some comments and advice back from my team later today on that.
Audrey.
Yeah, have you had any advice yet on how many people cancelled flights because of pre-flight testing?
No, I haven't had any concrete numbers on that. Yeah, I'm happy to look into that. I think in some cases, I think MB, through the booking system, have been working very hard to try, if there is a need to shuffle a little bit, say by 24 hours, they've been working very hard to try and accommodate that. So.
Do you know?
I don't know, but I'll find out whether they're keeping a tally of the number of people that they've assisted with that.
While that investigation's been underway into how the woman got it, has there been any additional changes since then to how MIQ is being handled at the moment?
Look, the Pullman continues to be on a state of high alert, if you like. So they're still working very, very hard at the Pullman just to be that extra bit vigilant. All of our managed isolation facilities are very, very vigilant, though. I would say that you could almost say that they're always on a state of high alert there for COVID-19. So we continue to look at it. You'll see we made some immediate decisions around delaying the release of some of the people who were due to be released, adding those extra tests just for that extra layer of protection.
This is something of a cerebral question, but is there a point at which we have vaccinated enough of our population that we no longer are trying to eliminate COVID-19? In other words, we're okay with small numbers of cases because there's enough of a vaccinated population that it won't threaten to overwhelm our health system, and we'll be able to care for those who do get seriously ill?
Yes, there will be a point when we need to adjust our approach from an elimination strategy, which is, again, as you've said quite nicely, no community transmission, so we eliminate community transmission. If we think of other diseases like measles, where we have achieved elimination status, that is also very dependent on what is happening internationally. And hence the comments from the Director General of the World Health Organization. Actually, every country needs the whole global population to achieve a high level of vaccination before we can really get back to what will be a new normal, but a different sort of world with COVID-19. But clearly, the higher our vaccination rates onshore, the sooner and more open we will be able to sort of go back to arrangements, back to level zero.
That there will be global elimination of COVID-19, or is it more likely to become endemic, but because of vaccination, not pose such a serious threat anymore?
Because of the nature of these viruses, it's more likely to be endemic. We've successfully eliminated smallpox. We're close to eliminating polio, but it's very few diseases that it's possible to eliminate or eradicate, I guess is a better word. These coronaviruses and influenza viruses do tend to become endemic.
Okay, Audrey, you get the lucky last.
Okay, if the worst affected countries should be at the front of the queue, and we're so good, should we be at the back of the queue for vaccines?
No, because I mean, there's still risk and for countries who aren't currently dealing with community outbreaks. So, you know, we want to get our border workers vaccinated as quickly as we can. We want to get as much of the population vaccinated as quickly as we can. But I do draw the distinction between the delivery of vaccines on a more regular program and those who are using emergency approvals to vaccinate before those processes have been completed. We don't have justification in New Zealand to be using an emergency approvals process at this point.
So where are we in the queue?
Well, I've always said, you know, in terms of the regular program as opposed to the emergency program, I've always said that we're at the front of the queue. The pre-purchase agreements that we've got are right up there in terms of what other countries have been able to secure as well.
Fit with your previous comment that you find it hard on in a humanitarian sense to say that we should get the vaccine when there's so much trouble out there.
I think, like I said, if you look at the emergency approval process and the emergency vaccination campaigns that are happening around the rest of the world, well, not all places, but in the places where there are, you know, where they're dealing with really, really big problems, I think that that's justifiable, and I think you can understand that on a humanitarian basis, and you can understand why the vaccine companies are prioritising supporting those efforts.
How can you say we're in front of the queue when Singapore is already vaccinating?
Again, look, I'm not going to get into every other country's discussions and how they've managed to secure their supplies, but if you look at New Zealand internationally in terms of the regular supply of shipments, we are right at the front of the queue for those. Thank you very much, everybody.